Hello, everyone, and welcome to the closing session of the Center for Victim Research's Virtual Institute. We're so excited about this session. When we first set up this virtual institute about trauma research and what it means for our work, we knew we really wanted to end on a note of hope. And for that, we immediately thought of Sherry Hamby. Sherry has done so much work looking at the strengths that victims have, both that get them through crisis and that they build from having gone through trauma. So we are really excited about today's session. For those of you who who are watching live and want to ask questions, please use that chat box that you'll find at the bottom corner of your screen. If you are watching the recording of this session, we will have the discussion board open for a few days. So please use the discussion board to ask additional questions of one another and our presenters. We'll try to check in and make sure that those questions are answered. I want to remind you that this session and every part of the Virtual Institute is supported with funding from the Office for Victims of Crime at the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. However, the opinions, recommendations, everything that is said here does not necessarily reflect the official position of the Department of Justice, but we appreciate their support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, Sherry Hamby, and Sherry will then be interviewed by Heidi Notario. We'll close with questions from you all. Sherry, take it away.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you so much to Casey and to Susan and everyone at CVR for having this virtual institute. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I'm so happy to be part of it. Today, I also want to acknowledge my co-partner, Heidi Notario. She and I are going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to organize the webinar perhaps a little differently than some of the others you may have seen in the past. So we're going to hopefully split it up into roughly equal thirds. So in this first third, I'm going to talk about some of my work and some of my journey with trying to adopt a strengths-based approach to working with victims. And in the second part, I'm going to hand it over to Heidi, and we are going to do an interview where we're going to hopefully get into a wide range of topics on resilience, on trauma, on evidence-based programming, on careers and navigating and whatever else we want to talk about. And then we're going to leave a really good chunk of time at the end for you all to weigh in and like an Ask Us Anything type of format, and hopefully have an even more wide-ranging discussion. So I want to thank Heidi and Casey and Susan for letting us have this little adventure here with a slightly different approach. All right. Also, I'm going to be talking about a lot of work today. Some of it comes from my lab and some of it comes from other places, but I did also want to acknowledge some of my collaborators and also all of the many people that we've interviewed over the years, or all the focus groups we've done. All the people have really taken a chance on sharing their stories with us and have been so appreciative of this chance to feel like they're not getting defined by the worst thing that's happened to them, and able to tell their stories about what they've done to try to overcome and thrive despite their burdens of trauma. And so I wanted to start with offering just a little bit of my own professional journey in this way. And so when I first got interested in violence, my area of focus was domestic violence. And this was really the environment that we were in at that time. And I saw some chats earlier that suggest, that perhaps it hasn't even changed that much. But there was a lot of victim blaming. There were common to depict victims as passive or in denial. There were best-selling books that centered problems with interpersonal violence in women or in the victims, and even peer-reviewed journal articles that would use phrases like intentional game players or masochistic self-states. And, well, I think I could say that from the very beginning that I had some discomfort with some of these presentations and these ways of casting victims, that it's also true that at that same time I was trying very hard to become a professional psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I was trying really hard to master this stuff at the same time, so learning about the cycle of violence and danger assessment and all those kinds of things. And, you know, my research work also really just reflected this focus on identifying rates and risk factors and establishing the negative consequences of violence, as if there perhaps were some question really about whether or not, you know, that was not problematic. And it took me a really long time, and I would say even like 15 or 20 years, before I fully appreciated how problematic this way of approaching it was, and how deficit-based and how unfair it really was to define people by the worst thing that has happened to them, and to start to really understand what it would mean. And so, you know, I guess, like I said, I've had some discomfort with that for a long time, but to really start to have some idea about what needs to change and what we could be doing differently that would really radically transform that approach. And that's what, and then I'm still in the middle of that journey, very much so, but that's what I really want to talk with you about today, and hopefully offer you another way of thinking that, depending on whether your training was very much like mine, perhaps you haven't had a chance to hear about. So a lot of times, it might not seem like it makes much sense, but really, like, a really key turning point for me in understanding this was my work in polyvictimization. And so polyvictimization is a concept that is much like adverse childhood experiences or complex trauma or these other terms, and the key element of all of these ideas is that you need to not just look at one particular type of abuse. So the question isn't really, is somebody a victim of domestic violence or not, or are they a victim of child abuse or sexual assault or not, in this yes-no kind of way, but trying to understand the full burden of victimization that someone has experienced across their lifetime in multiple settings, perhaps multiple perpetrators, and understanding all the different types of violence that somebody has been exposed to. And when you take that approach, which really, you know, it's just emerged in the last 15 or 20 years, what you find is this enormous dose-response relationship where trauma symptoms and a whole bunch of health outcomes like heart disease and asthma and things like that, that they're all really very largely influenced by the total number of different victimization experiences. But another thing that you find, and you can see this in this slide here, that if you take that approach, that you'll see that pretty much everybody gets exposed to violence at some point in their life, especially once you start to understand that exposures are important, even if you're not the direct victim yourself. Like if a loved one is sexually assaulted or you witness violence in the streets, that these exposures all add to your total burden too. And in this sample, I mean, this is just one of, and many I could show you, but in this particular sample that was just young people with an average age of 16, already 9 out of 10 of them were reporting exposure to at least one form of violence, and many of them had been exposed to multiples. And if you widen that out even further and think about other types of adversity, like a death in the family or unemployment or divorce or things like that, well, then even in this very young sample who are all under age 21, it got up to like 99.5% of the sample. And, I mean, I think that's something that we just don't really talk about or acknowledge enough, that that violence is not rare, that exposure to these kinds of burdens is not rare. My own, ACE score is not 0. I've been, exposed to violence in my past, and I think it is fair to say that pretty much anybody listening to this has probably had some kind of exposure to. And so, on one hand, that can be a very grim thing to realize, but it can also mean, I think the huge important thing about that is that it also means that resilience is not rare. Anne Maston has this lovely phrase. She calls it ordinary magic, which I think is a wonderful way to think about it. And in fact, that many people with very, very high burdens of adversity manage to overcome that and thrive, and really even some of the most accomplished people out there are people who have tremendous burdens of trauma. And what that means is that there's this whole universe of pathways to overcoming and healing that we've really just started to scratch the surface of. And if we understand that this is something that pretty much every single person is going to have to do in their lifetime, I just think it opens up a whole lot of possibilities, and that all of us could really be bringing our own understanding of what we do when we go through tough times into our work with our clients. Instead, as is still too often the case, there are lots of ways, both in the broader general culture and in our services, in which we still have this very deficit-focused lens. Part of it's problems with language, so there are problems with words like addict or schizophrenic, and the problem with words like that is that they take somebody's biggest problem and the biggest struggle that they're having, and then they turn that into a noun and they use that to define that person. And similarly, in our services, it's still too often true that we just don't have good access to wellness services and prevention services, and that people have to get a diagnosis or even a conviction before they can access the kind of help they need to overcome the types of trauma that all of us are going through. And we still too often define success in terms of just removing symptoms, and there's such a disconnect between that and how we think about our own lives. So when I think about my own life, I certainly don't think, well, I just hope I never meet the clinical cutoff for the Beck Depression Inventory. I think about my own life in terms of trying to make a contribution and trying to, take care of my family and, the things that give me meaning and fulfillment. And I'm sure that for the rest of you that that's the same. So if we go with that insight that many of these people are dealing with the same kinds of things that we're dealing with, and that many of them want the same kinds of things that we want, then I think that starts to provide some ideas about what a different approach would look like. There's a lot of people now who are working on making strengths-based approaches, and there are several elements that they pretty much all share. So the first and perhaps the most important is to really align with the life goals of your clients, and not force on them some definition of absence of symptoms or diagnoses or things like that without, maybe you might have to do that for insurance purposes or whatever, but that you both mutually understand that you're working together on these goals that both of you share. That you focus on developing assets and resources and beefing up people's strengths and trying to make them even, better people than they were before, instead of just trying to take away symptoms. And that it does require, what I usually say about this is like keeping our eye on the prize, is that sometimes I think it's, there's so many institutional pressures and there's so many financial pressures and other issues that we're dealing with, and I'm sure we'll probably get into those in the discussion, and I understand that they're really hugely important. But it's also true that, the reason that all of us are in this work and the reason that all of these institutions exist in the first place is to promote the safety and well-being, of individuals, of families, and of all of our communities that we live in. And that if we should be careful about getting too caught up in like narrow institutional mandates and forget like the reason that those mandates exist. along those lines, one thing that it is true that if you take poly-victimization scores or trauma history measure of any kind, and you look at the relationship between that with trauma symptoms or well-being or any physical health-related quality of life or any kind of physical or mental health outcome, you are going to see that relationship. It's one of the most replicated and most stable relationships that are out there in the social sciences, is that, you know, a trauma history will increase the likelihood of more negative outcomes in the future. But it's also true, and this is pretty well known in some fields, but not very much in victimization fields or human services fields that are connected to victimization, is that good stuff is more important than bad stuff. And so, again, this is from some of our recent data, but there are many other studies that have the same finding. And so you can see, if you look at the dark blue piece of the pie, I'm not sure how to point to it, but that, you know, that yes, that your trauma history, your history of exposure to adversities is certainly a piece of the pie that influences how you're functioning now. But if you also look at people's strengths, their assets, their resources, the things that they've got going for them, that these are even bigger pieces of the pie. And so strengths-based approaches also hold this incredible potential for us to be so much more effective and so much more impactful when we're working with people, because if we can shift these big pieces of the pie, we can make a real difference in people's lives. We're working with this framework that we call resilience portfolios, and in the resilience portfolio framework, there are 3 different domains that we focus on, and these are the domains that research has shown are most important for helping people overcome trauma. So there are other kinds of good strengths and stuff too, but these are really key specifically for overcoming trauma. And the first is meaning making, and meaning making is basically connecting to something larger than yourself. And this is one that probably is perhaps the most neglected and most conventional psychotherapies and psychoeducational programs and prevention or school-based programs or any of those types of things. We don't very often, surprisingly, get into talking about meaning making, but we're going to come back to this because this is just a really important topic. There are, when I talk about meaning making, there are a lot of different ways to get meaning, and most of them are excellent ways to pursue it. For example, probably all of us here today on a Friday afternoon, we've shown up because we're dedicated to the cause of trying to reduce the burden of violence and trauma in our communities. I mean, that's why I'm here. I'm sure that's why Heidi and Casey and Susan and the rest of you all are here. Many of us, of course, are also committed to our roles as teachers or therapists or parents. There are other ways, religion and spirituality, of course, and there's many different ways, but all of them have, what they share in common is that they're connecting to something outside of yourself and something beyond just this kind of hedonistic self-interest. The second domain is regulatory strengths, and these are basically anything that helps people control their behaviors or their emotions. A lot of the literature focuses a lot on the kind of short-term goals, like maybe some of you have seen that marshmallow test where they, you know, put a marshmallow in front of a kid and see how long they can go without eating it, more or less. But I think it's really important in terms of thinking about thriving and well-being to understand that that part of self-regulation is being able to really apply yourself to much longer-term goals. So, for example, you know, sticking with your homework and keeping up on your readings and going to classes long enough to get your college degree or something like that. Those are also like regulatory strengths. And then the third large domain are the interpersonal strengths. This is the biggest domain that extends to the rest of the social ecology. So it includes your family, your peers, your friends, your community, and the broader culture that you live in, and all of the different ways that at all these different levels, and of course that would include like institutions and services too, that we can help other people and not just ourselves thrive after and help overcome adversity. In this one, I apologize for this sort of data-heavy slide, but there is a particular point here that I want to make that I hope you will bear with me. So this is the whole range of strengths and outcomes that we looked at in our last study that I was showing you some other results from. And what I just wanted to highlight here is that sometimes without realizing it, a lot of the work that has been done in psychology and social work and related fields is work that has been done by people who come from white middle-class backgrounds. And whether they realize it or not, I think they're often bringing that lens to this work. And, which certainly is a legitimate lens in and of itself, but it can also be limiting because there are lots of people who don't come from that background. And so one of the real big focuses of our research program is to try to get a better job of understanding the strengths that people use from a more diverse range of backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity and culture and all these different kinds of things. And what I wanted to show you here is that if you look at the differences on our scales of strengths between Black and white youth, that there are a number of scales where the European American or white youth, who are in the blue, have much higher scores than Black youth do in the orange, but the purple boxes are around the new ideas that emerge from our focus groups and one-on-one interviews with people in our communities. Most of my work is based in rural Appalachia, and you can see that a lot of these new ideas, there are either very small differences, as you can see in the middle, between white youth and Black youth on things like self-reliance and group connectedness and family well-being, or even that we identified some strengths that were higher among the Black youth than the white youth, like psychological endurance, recovering positive affects, and spiritual well-being. And so if we open our minds, I just think that we've just barely started to scratch the surface of all of the different assets and resources that people use to help them overcome trauma, and that it's really important to make sure that we are assessing all of the strengths and resources in all of the communities and in all of the families that we work with. I just want to walk very quickly a couple of examples of how this might play out in a clinical setting and what a strength-based approach would look like compared to a more conventional approach. So if you take, for example, in a conventional approach, a young child that's diagnosed with ADHD, so what that would look like in terms of resilience portfolio domains is that that child is probably their weakest area would be the regulatory strengths, right? They might have trouble with regulating their behaviors and their emotions and their communications. But if you don't have to stop there or even limit it to that understanding of it. So one thing you could do is you could look in the other domains. So for example, a lot of kids with ADHD might have supportive families and supportive parents, and so that could be a resource that they could draw on. The teachers might find them frustrating to work with, but some kids with ADHD might be the class clown in their class, and so they might have pretty good peer relationships, even if they're still having other issues in the classroom. And so you could bring those in and think about how you could use those resources to help them with their self-regulation area. And then you could also redefine the goals of not just taking away the symptoms of attention deficit, I mean deficit's even in the name of this one, or hyperactivity, and then focus on suggesting to them that they can improve their self-regulation and that they can improve their control over their behaviors and emotions, and so frame the treatment goals in positive terms. Or another example would be an adult with a depression diagnosis in a conventional framework. And then here, if you look across those portfolios, especially if you're thinking about someone with mild or moderate depression, they might actually have a strength in the regulatory domain. Perhaps in some cases they may even be a bit overregulated there. But you might use that strength if they're still sticking to a routine, or if they have good opportunity to follow through with homework or things like that. And then you could use that as some way to help them build up in these other domains. So for example, when depression, like a classic one, would mean that they need more meaning in their lives and that they need to come up with stronger reasons for living and stronger connections outside themselves, or building their interpersonal network if they're socially isolated. So this is just a couple of quick examples about what this would look like if you were trying to rethink through your caseloads if you're in a clinical setting. So when we first started working on this resilience portfolio idea, my ultimate goal, I mean it still is my ultimate goal, is to come up with a sort of a profile of key strengths that would look something like an MMPI, if you're familiar with that, so that you would have, you know, you'd see whether they were like high in the regulatory ones and low in meaning making, et cetera, as we've been talking about. And that in each one of these domains that we would try to identify the 3 or 4 most important, you know, specific strengths in each of these domains. And I really thought originally that the big challenge there was going to be taking all the different strengths that have been studied in the literature, because if you go outside of violence research and into like social and personality and places like in positive psychology, there's been dozens and dozens of strengths looked at. So far we've looked at these 35 in my own work, and I really thought the challenge was going to be narrowing it down to like 10 or 12 of the most important ones and trying to choose like which of these 10 or 12 were like most important. But in fact, that has not turned out to be what happens at all. And that if you really compare head to head, so if you ask yourself the question, so if you're in a clinical setting, for example, if you want to be able to tell somebody, well, if you only have 6 sessions with this person, then you would get more bang for your buck if you focused on beefing up their emotional regulation skills instead of their social support, or, you know, maybe vice versa. Like, that's the sort of stuff that we were hoping to be able to tell people. And I really thought it was going to be so hard to narrow it down, but in fact, now we've done more than 4,000 surveys and hundreds of interviews and had dozens and dozens of people in focus groups. And it turns out that actually only a very small set of these, when you put them up head to head each other like that, really look substantially more promising than the others. And so that's good, I think, if you're looking for clinical guidance. I haven't completely decided what I think about that yet, but I'll tell you where we are with that now. And so for meaning making, a sense of purpose is far and away, in fact, out of all 35 of those strengths, a sense of purpose is definitely like the #1 big time winner against all the other 34. Hands down, slam dunk, that's the one that accounts for the most in their current level of well-being and their degree of trauma symptoms and all of those kinds of things. In the self-regulation category, the one that I think is most promising is actually one that we discovered by doing all of these focus groups and interviews. So usually when people talk about emotional regulation in the clinical or research worlds, they're talking about regulating anger or regulating distress, like feelings of sadness or being upset. But what we found people talked about, like, really made the difference between whether or not they were able to, you know, thrive again or overcome adversity, was whether they could actually regulate their emotions so well that they could move back into being in like a clearly good mood, or not just like a temporary good mood, but, you know, like consistently in a, you know, positive emotions, and can cheer themselves back up again, or learn to let go. And so just to take like a small example, like if you have a flat tire on your way into work, is that going to ruin, you know, your day or your week, or is that something that maybe you're going to be able to put behind you and turn your attention to other things by lunchtime? And so that's that sort of ability to monitor and regulate positive emotions and not just negative ones. And then in the interpersonal strengths, maybe in the discussion we'll get into this, this has actually been a really a surprisingly challenging area for me, but the area that is, the one strength that is definitely consistently working the best right now is social support that they've received. And so before I turn it over to Heidi, I just want to very quickly give a couple of examples of how this would look if you took these ideas and these findings and tried to translate that into practice. Like, what would you do differently if you were translating it into practice? And I just want to pick, there's a lot of different answers to that question, and I hope we'll get to talk about more of them. But I've picked two to highlight that I've chosen because they are so easy to integrate into so many different settings. You can integrate them into conventional therapy or into schools or clinics or healthcare settings, and those two are motivational interviewing and narrative. Motivational interviewing is a really incredibly well evidence-based approach, and the way it's most commonly done is that it's used as an adjunct to whatever program is already happening. It's been evaluated a lot in substance abuse and addiction treatment and relationship counseling for CBT and all kinds of things like that. So whatever program you're already running, if you have an addiction program or cognitive behavioral therapy program, you still run that program. And the one thing that you change, though, is that you take the first, or perhaps if you can afford it, the first 2 sessions, and you turn those into motivational interviewing sessions. And in those sessions, it really is about creating a space to talk about, to bring that meaning-making piece in, to talk about, like, why are they there, what are they looking for in terms of goals or in the future. And it's really important to create this as a partnership, and again, to go back to this idea that you're going to find goals that you can work on and align yourself with together. So part of some of the key principles of motivational interviewing is recognizing that everybody is an expert in their own lives and that they have a full understanding of all the context and complexities that you're never going to have. And, and to understand that ambivalence about changing is normal, and that there's always going to be, complications about it, or maybe scary things about what would it mean to, like, make big, huge changes in your life, and to not just kind of come at those or dismiss them or try to argue them away, but to really let some space for exploring them so that you can talk through some of those issues on the upfront before you start into doing the more specific targeted exercises or approaches that you're going to do in your treatment. And there's a lot of different elements for it. There's tons of good stuff online about motivational interviewing, but perhaps one of the most important concepts about it is this idea of rolling with resistance. And so if somebody does push back or express doubts or whatever, that you don't just try to argue them away, but you really, give them that space. And, there's lots of online examples of good language to use about that to help you unpack those things and hopefully identify the reasons for those ambivalence so that that can get addressed in treatment too, and not just sort of ignored or hope it's going to go away. And then the other topic is narrative. And so this was something that really started with some work by James Pennebaker more than 20 years ago now. And from the hat of being like a clinical psychologist, he's a social psychologist, it just was kind of a crazy idea. I'm not even sure why he thought this would work. But what he did is he took a bunch of freshmen who were entering college for the first time in the fall, and he randomly assigned them to 2 groups. And one group wrote about their most traumatic experience for 20 minutes a day for just 3 days, so just a 60-minute total intervention. And in the control group, they also wrote for 20 minutes a day for 3 days, but they only wrote about study skills and how they were going to try to organize their time over the course of the semester. And then he went back at the end of the semester, and not only did he find that the people who had written about the traumatic event were reporting better psychological health and well-being at the end of the semester, but he also went and got the records for all of these students from the Student Health Center and found out that those students had gone significantly fewer times to see the nurses for colds or flu or problems like that, and had fewer infectious diseases over that period too. So that's really a pretty remarkable result, and it has now also been repeated over and over and over again, dozens of studies using dozens of different types of populations, cancer patients, small kids, I mean, it's everything in between. And even Laura King calls it the 2-minute miracle because she did this experiment where she was like, well, you know, it's 60 minutes, do you even need that? And so she and her graduate student did this study where they just had students write for 2 minutes a day for 3 days. It was just a 6-minute total intervention, and several weeks later they were still able to find significant differences in those two groups. And so something that had an impact for weeks and only took 6 minutes. So I know a lot of times that resources are strapped and time is really tight, but these are very, very plausible ways of making a difference. I tell people if you can only do one thing with somebody, that you should do a narrative, that giving them that sense of narrative coherence and letting them sort of understand like how the bad things in their lives like fit into this bigger picture, and giving them the space to write about post-traumatic growth and what they got out of it and how they're going to move past it. You know, it's just a huge gift to give to anybody, and it's so powerful and has not only documented psychological effects, but well-documented effects on people's immune systems and stress levels and other physiological markers of well-being. And then I put these up here. I actually don't like Pennebaker's prompt the best. I think you can make a much more positive framing about it. I put these on the slide so that people would have access to them, but just to know that there's a lot of different ways of approaching this narrative. And then the last point I want to make before we switch over to the interview with Heidi is that I hope that you will really consider thinking even further outside the box in your work with people, especially if you're in schools or community groups or domestic violence shelters or any places where you really have a chance to offer lots of different types of programming in your agency, is that there's tons of evidence emerging and so much. I mean, this is just such a wonderful time in these ways that go way beyond like traditional psychotherapy or traditional psychoeducational or prevention programming, and that a lot of these types of programs like mindfulness or exercise, they have impacts in these studies, in many, many studies, that are easily equivalent to the impacts that you'll get with like antidepressant medication or conventional psychotherapy or CBT or anything like that. And they really are something that I hope, you know, we really should be using a lot of these a lot more. And I'll just end that, you know, I'm a big fan. My particular favorite out of all of the ones on this list here is forest bathing, which is a translation of a Japanese term, Shinrin Yoku, where there's been now a number of randomized trials that just show that even spending time in the natural environment, something that, you know, in some of our communities has really been lost, you know, that it doesn't have to be exercise, it can just be walking or picnicking or anything like that, that can really have a positive impact on people too. And so there's a lot of, you know, these are the kinds of things I think many of us do when we feel stressed. I mean, like one of my #1 stress reduction coping techniques is walking with my dogs in the woods. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that we really should be recommending to our clients as well. In Scotland now, that's an official prescription that you can get from the National Health Service for depression, is to go take walks in the woods. So I think it is, as Casey opened with, I love the frame of having this be like a hopeful ending and a moment of hope, is I think that there's so many positive things we can do and so much real potential for people to truly overcome whatever burden of adversity that they've got. And I look forward to discussing all of this more. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to switch gears, and I'm going to pass the baton to Heidi, and she and I are going to have a conversation about some of these ideas.
Thanks so much, Sherry, and wow, so many things to ask you. I'm really excited about just listening to the presentation and all of these thoughts, and things like notions like resilience is not rare. And really looking at that, regardless of which part of the work or which area we are, or in which profession we are walking, you know, what is our path. I'm very interested in your own journey around when you told us a little bit about becoming a professional and surviving the academic space, which I think you've done very well. Um, and then what did it take? I think you said a few things, but what did it take for you to be able to shift from the tight or rigid at times instruments or looking at things like the cycle of violence, which you mentioned, as the thing that would explain everything around violence, or having to produce X number of studies so you could get tenured and everything else, all the pressures that are in the academia. How have you been able to make this shift?
Well, some of it is really from stepping outside of the sort of the traditional career path in some ways. I mean, one of the things that I think happened is that, like I said, I'm trying so hard to, because much younger then, and of course, as we all once were, and as like looking at, trying very hard to look like a professional and look like I really belonged in the room. And so I'm taking all of these forms and tools very seriously. And for those of you, like specifically with domestic violence victims, which is where a lot of my early work with victims of violence was, I think what I started to realize is after you start doing some of these danger assessments, that one of the things that started to really strike me is that every single solitary person that I ever gave that danger assessment to always came out in like the highest risk category. And, and was not that, and it was, that just didn't make sense to me. I mean, you could tell from talking to them that yeah, I mean, they were all in bad situations. I mean, they were seeking help for violence, obviously, but it just felt like, I mean, and all the safety plans were just these one-size-fits-all stuff. If you go online even now to some of the national sites, they'll still have you'll still see some of the items from those original items that Barbara Hart wrote way back in the early 90s, like keep change on you at all times, and it's like, and I don't know how many people listening even appreciate that, but the reason that, for those of you who are younger than me, like the reason that people used to keep change on them at all times is so that they would have a quarter to use a payphone for, and so it just, these one-size-fits-all answers didn't fit. And then what would happen is that, a lot of women, I mean, they were always like so nice and so respectful and polite about it. And sometimes looking back now, but when I first started doing this work, I didn't have kids of my own, and it was always like such a problem to place people in shelters. And I think it's just gotten better, but it has not like completely gone away. But at that point in time, so we're not talking like back in the 90s, it was almost impossible to find a shelter that would accept a boy older than 6 years old. And even today, I think it can be pretty hard to find shelters that will take adolescent boys, even like 13, 14, 15 years old in some places. And so I just used to tell them, like, well, maybe you can, you can just go now, and you can just, work on your own safety, and then, I'm really concerned about you, and you can take your daughters with you, or maybe there's some other place that you could leave them with your parents, or, we used to like brainstorm about all of this type of stuff, like how you could, access help through these agencies, but somehow in some way, shape, or form, like leave your, 7-year-old or 12-year-old, or even, I mean, my kids now, even now, I have a 16-year-old son and a 19-year-old daughter, and if I were in some sort of like horribly dangerous situation, like the idea of like leaving my 16-year-old somewhere, I mean, it just is like inconceivable to me. And I, and they would just look at you like, I'll think about it, and 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 I had nothing else to offer, because that's like what I had been taught to do, is that what they needed to all do was like go to shelter, and that was the only, option. And here they are with this danger assessment score that's really bad, and, there's only so many times you can I realized that it was problematic for a long time. I guess it took me a while. It wasn't that hard to figure out that there was something not working out really well here. It took me a little bit longer. And I'm talking like years and not like weeks to really start telling people, there seems to be there's something that's not really working here. And but it maybe took me longer than that before I just realized what a how much of a transformation of these services there would really need to be in order to push past that. But, I can still just remember, even though it's been a long time now, talking to so many of those women and just, feeling just realize that the stuff that I had been taught to say to them was just really, really, really wrong,
Well, that's something, right? And I think it can be at times frightening, which I think is sometimes keeps people doing the same thing. Because if it's not that, then what can we do instead? And I think training folks to think the same way and think about survivors' choices as being shelter, leading an abusive intimate partner. Those are filing a protection from abuse orders. I think those are very concrete expectations that sometimes are placed on survivors as the only avenues. So listening to you also reminded me of some of the work that several culturally specific organizations have been doing.
Yeah.
That challenging somewhat this kind of a mold that we see and hear about, and they have been lifting of survivors' voices in the way that you said so eloquently, aligning with the life goals of people, which I think, that's a no-brainer, right? Isn't that what we all should do? But it's harder, it's easier said than done. I think, what do you have to say about that? Why is it that we all don't do that? Just aligning with the life goals of people, of survivors in this case.
Yeah, well, I am a firm believer in this sort of, change the form, change the world idea. And so actually, even before I did some of this work, some years ago, I created this new domestic violence safety plan, and it's called the VIGOR, and which stands for, I hope I can remember what it stands for. It stands for the Victim Inventory of Goals, Options, and Risk. And so it has this very explicit place for talking about goals, and yes, a place for documenting risk. I actually think that a lot of their sort of standard danger assessment scales are far too narrow about that, because they only talk about physical risk, and they don't talk about, legal jeopardies or financial threats, where, some of the suggestions that we make, people are at risk of ending up homeless or losing their health insurance, getting rejected by churches or families. There's a lot of things that are on the plate of a lot of victims who are trying to wrestle with this. And then, the toolkit, it comes with, also from qualitative work, it comes with this list of 140 some odd possibilities for things that people can do. Because, if you talk to people who eventually get into safer and healthier relationships, or into safer and healthier spaces, whether they're in relationship or not, a lot of the things that made differences for them were things like, getting a job or going back to school, and, and thinking much longer term than I think that a lot of our services do, which this has gotten better too in recent years with, at least in some of the bigger cities, with access to transitional housing, where they have access to supported housing for, a year or maybe even 2 years instead of 30 days or 60 days. You can't turn your whole entire life around in 30 days. That's just not realistic. I mean, if any of us like pondered trying to do that, and you know, but I think that I mean, the things that you just ticked off are things that we've had for 25 years, and I just don't understand like why there's still such a short list of things. I mean, I just don't see why that, you know, we all know that those can be very limited. I mean, I think an order of protection is a good idea because it's certainly a piece of the puzzle, but it's also just a piece of paper. It's not some kind of, you know, bulletproof shield or anything, and, you know.
Right. And, you know, so the work of Jill Davis, for example, how she separates in her writing in terms of safety planning, which is something you just touched on, as sometimes we have a very narrow lens to use to look at safety planning or the options that survivors have available to them. But she really makes a distinction of partner-generated risks, so the things that are associated to that partner, and then there are all of the other risks, like societal risks, like what comes with making a decision to leave an abusive relationship, whether it means leaving the community that you know and the resources that you've always had, and the other networks of support. So that could also bring in their own risks, you know, right? And also in research, we know that the most dangerous time is when survivors actually leave the abusive partner, right? So I think, as you said, the protection from abuse order isn't like a magic shield that would protect people. So it's all of that. Also remind me of the work of an organization that works with Latinx survivors, and their approach to safety planning takes like 4 different levels, really around the intimate partner, but it's also around, if these are immigrant survivors, their country of origin. It's about policies in place in the U.S. context. It's also about whether they're children that could be back in the country of origin. It's about other relatives that could also pose a threat to their safety. So I think something like that, if we continue with a narrow view of safety planning that is only around the risks that relate to the intimate partner, I think we fall super short. But unfortunately, right, it has been done for such a long time in that manner that I think the challenge of thinking outside of the box and going beyond all of that is critical in the around safety for survivors and the success and well-being of survivors. I think also thinking about those that do not live in violent relationships, that they just want the violence to end. So how does our advocacy change in there, right? In that context. I was very interested in the resilience portfolio that you talked about, and how our interventions could really be could really shift if we actually were to apply that approach or that framework. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you found around the meaning making, the sense of purpose that you found as such a strong indicator, such an important thing not to overlook?
Yeah, I just think, I mean, I totally agree with what all of what you said, and I think that, again, that just goes back to taking this more holistic approach, and part of, I guess another thing I would say about that is that as I touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but that there's just real othering that goes on, that probably, many of us have ended relationships, and we all know how difficult that can be, even when there's not any violence involved, and, then sometimes it can take planning and strategizing, and sometimes it's sort of a bumpy course where you get back together. Do you want to be together? Do you not want to be together? And and when we see our clients go through the same kinds of things, that we just put it in like a different bucket than, if our best friend were talking about it. And, but I don't think that these processes are really that different. And I think that's where, that sense of purpose really comes in. And so, one woman I knew a long time ago, liked to sing that really, so she started to go and volunteer at her child's school. And the reason that she did that was really initially largely motivated by the domestic violence, is that she was worried that her husband might come to the school and try to pick up the kid and disappear with him as a way of like getting at her, which of course all of us know, like such a risk that can be in some cases. But what ended up happening is that when she started spending all this time in the school and started doing all these things for all of these kids and stuff like that, is that she just really found, a place where she found so much purpose and meaning. And then she won the Volunteer of the Year award for the whole county that she was working in, which is really like a big deal. And, hundreds of volunteers are eligible for that. And and it was that walking that path that really gave her all of the other pieces she needed to come back and make changes in her life. And I think a lot of times that we put the cart before the horse, and that we expect people to, completely upend their lives and make all these major transformations, but we don't really necessarily do a very good job of communicating what that other life is going to look like, or what that would free them up to do. And I think that sometimes you really have to help people connect with that and even, get some experience with what that feels like before they can, a lot of the, most remarkable things that people endure or people pursue are because they really have a clear idea, a clear vision about what's going to, where they're going and what they're going to get out of it, and that they have to have that sense first. And so I think that a lot of times that, not just for domestic violence victims, but too many of our services, that there's this sort of underlying assumption that we all know, why you're in treatment for depression and what's going to happen and what you're going to get out of it, but we never actually verbalize it or talk about it, and so I think I think that's one of the things that a lot of the culturally responsive service agencies actually do much better, because many of those agencies, Caminar Latino or the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, or any of these places that are working on issues of violence against women, that they're very explicit that they are trying to preserve community and preserve identity and tradition. And sometimes a lot of their programs even are, they'll work on beading or quilting or they'll give spaces for these other kinds of things too. And that, I think, make it clear about why you should do this hard work, because this is part of helping your community survive, or this is part of helping your community thrive, or that is actually a lot better than a lot of mainstream services.
I was thinking of Caminar Latino, and I'm glad you mentioned, and really take a second to just share my respect for Dr. Julia Perilla, who we lost sadly, but who was the founder of Caminar Latino.
Yes,
and
yes.
To really, with Julia and her contributions, over the years, she oftentimes was accused of placing survivors at risk. Every time she implemented a new practice that was completely survivor-centered, people would tell her, "You're going to get these women killed." And she kept saying, "I'm just listening to what they're asking me to do." Really, every program at Caminar Latino really responded to what the community of survivors, were saying they needed. So why is it so hard to do this work in this manner? Why do you think? Moving away from the removal of symptoms kind of framework as a measure of success, or in this case, doing things that survivors truly wanted, and in many of them did not want to leave their abusive partners. So why is it so hard to do?
Well, I think, I do think, part of the problem that I think what you just talked about, yes, Julia is such a incredible figure in this field, and that sometimes that we've just gone too far into the other we've just swung so far in the direction of concerns about liability and about, making mistakes. And, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying about every time I give these danger assessments, that everybody gets like the same score, like, oh, this is bad, you're in danger of your life. And I guess in one level that it's just sort of, I mean, I guess that, what that gives me as a provider is that instead of, God forbid, that something happened and one of these women were killed, that I would be like, oh, well, I told her that she could get killed, and then like there's some sort of coverage or liability reduction that's happening there. But the thing is that we've gotten so concerned about that. And when I say we, I don't necessarily mean like individual advocates or providers, but I think like in terms of like broader institutions, and that they've gotten so concerned about that they're really telling that to way too many people. And I mean, at some point I stopped doing it, even though I could, but I could tell you that that none of the people that I work with were killed. I mean, so. And I realize that there's like way too many domestic violence murders out there, and that it is like a horrible problem from a societal level, but from, a day-to-day out in the field providing services level, the chance that any particular one of these women are going to become a murder victim is just really remote. And I think that somehow we've lost sight of that, and that, it's not the, it's not the life-threatening kind of emergency that like a heart attack is, and that a lot of these problems are more like, diabetes or asthma or some kind of chronic condition like that, and that we can, take a little bit longer frame. I remember one woman I worked with who was a very powerful, strong woman. I think our stereotypes and some of the media stereotypes are problematic about this too. So she was an EMT, physically strong, psychologically tough, and was in an abusive relationship. And she came to me, and I kind of went through all this stuff, and she got this horrible score on the danger assessment scale. And I'm like, well, so I'm happy to place you in a shelter, and I've worked pretty much almost exclusively in rural communities, and so that usually means going quite far distances to get to a shelter. And the closest one was about a 45-minute drive, but one that would be like more realistic, might have room for her, was more like 2 hours away. And so of course that meant that she wouldn't really be able to work. I mean, how's she going to be an EMT in her community if she's like living 2 hours away? And which is, I just think, one of many kind of financial problems that we just don't, realistically deal with when we're working with victims. And she's like, that's all very interesting advice, and it's good to know that I can do that if I feel like I have to. But I don't think I have to do that right now. And, and actually, I mean, she was the expert in her own life. She, like, that I don't think that's a good description. And she also had a lot of crisis training. And so she's like, I don't think that's a good description of how the degree of crisis that this is in right now. And she's like, I've got a plan. I've opened a bank account. I'm saving some money. I think 6 months from now, I'm going to be able to have enough money together to do like a deposit and first month's rent on an apartment. I'm going to start, getting the rest of my stuff together. And in 6 months, I'm going to move out, and then I'm going to file for divorce. And that's exactly what she did, and and it was perfectly reasonable and rational for her to have like a 6-month plan about how to deal with this problem, instead of oh my God, like it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you have to, completely make all of these, huge life decisions that are going to affect the next 10 years of your life, right now. I mean, I just think that that's, I mean, it's certainly not evidence-based practice at all. There's, no indication that kind of approach improves outcomes for victims.
So I think our time is up, and we probably should turn it over to Susan, I think, for the next segment. But I just wanted to end this part just asking folks to I guess, hold on to this idea that flexibility is something that we need here in this work, and to really, safety plans and interventions are very individualized. I mean, people's experiences and situations are very unique. And I think at times what we have done is to really apply the same approach to everybody. Like, there is one way of doing safety planning. There is one way of doing thinking about the future. So I think that's where we get in trouble. Assuming that everyone needs shelter, assuming that everyone is in danger of, their life is in danger. There are relationships where we know the danger is real and people have the reason to feel fear for their life. And I think there are many other instances in which the scenarios are different and people have options, like the instance that you talked about. So it really is a message of let's be flexible and let's reflect, based on each situation, and understand what's being asked of us, as opposed to applying this one-size-fits-all approach. Okay, so I guess it's Susan's turn now.
All right, well, this has been really interesting. And now, folks who are joining us live, now is the time for you to ask your questions in the chat box. You can either send questions to all participants or to host panelists and presenters. I will start with a question, Sherry.
Oh, okay.
Let's say that someone is running an informal support group. I think a lot of your presentation talked about clinicians and people who are licensed mental health providers. But let's say someone is running an informal support group for victims. How can they either incorporate principles of motivational interviewing or narrative in their work?
Sure. Both of those have really been used widely by paraprofessionals, by people who are not necessarily licensed providers, especially narrative. Narrative has been used in school settings. It's, as I said, Pennebaker is a social psychologist, so he is not a licensed provider and doesn't have training. Laura King is a positive psychologist, so even though they're psychologists, they are not clinically trained. And, I think that, it maybe touches a little bit on what we were just chatting about with Heidi, is it's complicated because I understand the reasons for this, and I certainly understand that people vary a lot, but, these things are available to people who are doing self-help, or we used to call it like bibliotherapy or things like that. And, you can listen to podcasts, or you can Google, narrative exercises for healing for depression or sexual abuse or whatever, the case may be. And, lots of people are doing this either without any kind of like feedback or supervision at all, or in these very informal settings. And there's really not any reason at all to think that that is problematic, So I would really encourage people, if you're running informal support groups, to really help people sort of tell their stories, or, maybe you could use this as an exercise. I think if you want to do motivational interviewing, and you have an ongoing group, that a couple of ways you could implement that in the group is you could, if you have an ongoing group, or one that's where people are dropping in or dropping out of, you could just kind of ask people to talk about like why they're there, what did they think it would be like, what did it turn out to be like, how's their life changed, what changes would they still like to make and why those are hard, and sort of, throw it open to those kinds of things. Or you could also, when somebody joins the group, if it's, like a one that a lot of domestic violence agencies, where there's just kind of this, they don't really tend to run cohorts of 6 groups for 12 weeks or whatever, that you can just drop in or drop out at any time. That when somebody comes for the first time, that you could just invite them to share their story and talk about it. And A lot of that motivational interviewing stuff is actually not that different than the way a lot of like AA and 12-step programs, run things when they come in and, I'm an alcoholic, and then usually what they do, they don't have to do it on the first session, but when they're ready, they usually tell their story, and that story is really usually pretty much a story that would be totally consistent with like a motivational interviewing or post-traumatic growth framework of, of how they ended up abusing alcohol or whatever it was, and how they finally hit them that they had to do something, and where they are on that path of trying to change their lives. And, I think that would, that AA, I think I would basically say that AA is essentially a narrative intervention, and I recommend it all the time because, as I mentioned, I live out in the, my work is based in these very rural areas and where there are very limited providers. So the mountain where the University of the South is, where I'm based, there's not even a single psychiatrist, for example, on the mountain, and there's just very few mental health providers of any type. And but there's half a dozen AA meetings that meet every week, and you can drop into any of them. And I think that I would encourage people to get flexible about giving people opportunities to share their story. And some of the work that we've done in my lab, not only writing about it, but also sharing your story with other people with the idea of, maybe, helping or inspiring someone else. A program that offered that, like when people were doing that, they got even better benefits than just from like the narrative alone.
Great. Before I go to the next question, I want to remind people, go ahead and enter your question into the chat box, and we'll make sure it gets asked. Sherry, you talked about danger assessments not being the be-all and end-all, that too often it just shows too many people are in danger. But we had a comment about reminding people that those can also be important, that we wouldn't necessarily want to throw out danger assessments as part of our work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a very high opinion of most danger assessments. Or if you take it into another thing that I've been getting a lot of questions about those last few days with like mass shootings, it's a similar problem if the goal is to, it depends on how you intend to use it. If you want to use danger assessments, this is what I would say, is that first, the number one most important thing is to avoid any danger assessments that use any kind of demographic characteristic as a risk marker, because it's just, and because there's a lot for like recidivism on parole and things like, like to help, there's a lot of different types of danger assessments out there. But if you are just, if it says because they're like a male under 25 or something like that, well, you can't help being a male under 25, and it just ends up profiling people in a way that doesn't really, there's nothing they can do about that. And so I don't think that it necessarily provides that much performance information, especially when you're taking it down to like an individual level. You have to remember that a lot of these danger assessments were developed on statistical analyses of group samples, and that they don't really necessarily come down to like individual prediction like that. And some of them are really problematic about putting things on the list that are out of control of the people in question. The other thing that I would say about them is that a lot of them have, like we've seen this in the news a lot, that there's all this, conversation about like, well, the relationship between mental health and violence. It's been flooding the news in the last few days after, the Dayton and El Paso shootings. But it's not really all that helpful to pick characteristics that are true of tens of millions of people. And so, there are tens of millions of people with substance abuse problems or who have psychological diagnoses, and almost very, very tiny percent of them ever go on to perpetrate any kind of aggression at all, much less like the severe kind of violence that most of us are worried about in like domestic violence agencies or those kinds of settings, or child maltreatment or what have you. And the problem with a lot of these danger assessments is that the work has not been done in most cases to do a good job of identifying risk factors that start to really narrow it down to like a much, higher, stronger relationship between the risks. So there are a few good predictors in that realm. I mean, certainly the best predictor of future violence is the nature and degree of past violence. And so, that is obviously like a warning system. Access to guns and other weapons, I mean, that is certainly an important one. Another one that gets to be something that's a little bit rarer than just if you ever had a mental health diagnosis is serious threats of suicidality. I mean, there are a few personal characteristics, but a lot of the danger assessments take these ones that at least do a better job of getting to some more specific risk for like serious, life-threatening violence, and then throw in a bunch of other stuff. And then even in the statistical analysis, I love statistics, and I spend a great deal of my life doing statistics, and I do think that statistics are incredibly important path forward to understanding what's really going on in these things. But statistics, by their nature, always have a certain amount of error and uncertainty in them. And I think what happens is that in the research, like if you can take a group of perpetrators and you've got data that show like which ones of them went on to commit, like a serious aggravated assault and which ones didn't, and then you're trying to sort, I mean, that's how these dangerous assessments get developed, and then they try to figure out characteristics that are associated with the ones that are known to be more dangerous in the sample. But statistically, if you're right like 70 or 75% of the time, then you're doing a fantastic job, like statistically. But when you bring that down to like one person in front of you, it means that like basically like for every 4 people that you see that one of, your advice is going to be wrong, on average over time, like one of those times. And that, and so they're not very precise, and they get used in ways that, I guess that was what my point is, that, like all these women were told on, this danger assessment that they were highly at risk of like lethal violence, but then, years have gone by, and it's I don't live in that community anymore, but I'm still in touch with people in that community, and I know that none of those women ever got murdered. And now that, and so there's this, when it gets translated from the research world to the clinical world, those kind of predictive things, we're not very good at that kind of prediction, and it often comes with this. I was just talking about this in a meeting in Chicago a couple of days ago, that we start acting in a clinical setting like there's a lot more precision in these instruments than they are. And so I think that they get used sometimes in very problematic ways that implies a level of certainty that they just never can support.
We had another thought about writing. One of the participants said he's been using the Pennybacker writing technique, but with his clients, he encourages them to throw away their writing, tear it up after they have written it out. What do you think of that approach?
I think that there can be something, I think it depends. There are probably a couple different ways you might be using that. I mean, perhaps there's supposed to be like some metaphor for putting it behind you. I guess I would just for the most part, I would probably recommend in a situation like that, like following the client, and if they really want to keep it, I wouldn't force them to tear it up. I think if you want to encourage them to sort of put it aside and then maybe do some work and then revisit it later, that could also be useful. There's not, except for the study that I just mentioned that we did where we looked at the benefits of sharing the stories and writing with others in a peer group, there's not really been any research on how to dispose of the narrative afterwards, and so I couldn't really offer like an evidence-based recommendation one way or the other about that.
All right. The clarification that just came in was that those were Pennebaker's original instructions in the study. So you're right, there may have been something along the lines of letting people start fresh.
Yeah, I don't think that, I don't know if that's what he still does. I mean, like I said, there have been a lot. I mean, the one thing I would say that is the evidence does support is that people have tweaked those prompts, and even Pennebaker himself has used slightly different ones over the years, and there are some like quite very different prompts about writing about values or positive experiences and things like that. I can tell you from the work that I've done with my colleagues, John Gritch and Vicki Banyard, that the only thing we found that really makes a difference in terms of all of that sort of stuff is that you have to write about something personal and meaningful. So we did a evaluation of this school-based program where the kids they were given a bunch of suggestions of prompts, and they could choose to write about events in their own lives and deal with, and when they were given that option, most of them did. About half of them actually wrote about something fairly traumatic, and then another 30%, 35% or so wrote about something that was really personally meaningful but wasn't traumatic. But then that last 15%, like they could technically still have gotten participation credit for this program by just writing something about like how, you know, Abe Lincoln was an inspiring figure or whatever, and it turned out that those kids got like no I mean, they were sort of back to like study skills territory, that those kids got no psychological benefits about it at all. And the kids that wrote about the adversities got the biggest psychological benefit, although the group that wrote about positive, meaningful experiences got benefits too, but just not quite as extensive. So I think that that the specifics of it doesn't matter that much, but the key thing is that you're just helping people with their own narrative coherence in their own lives. I think I saw somebody at the very beginning when people were sending in some introductions about, like working with victims who sometimes are very disorganized and incoherent in the midst of a crisis when they're telling their stories. And so I really think the benefit for most people is is helping them impose that framework and that structure. And I tell my own students a lot that even though none of us are probably actually in movies in which we're the lead character, and that it's in some sense of it's probably really false to think about your life in that way, as having some kind of narrative arc where everything is just kind of happens for a reason, and you're and that you're going from one thing to the next and always building on what happened before. There's a fair amount of research out there that our understanding of ourselves in that way is probably not really accurate. But it is nonetheless definitely the psychologically healthiest way to think about your life. And, and so I think that that's what narrative does, is that it helps people maybe who have kind of avoided thinking about it, or maybe they were too young to fully understand it when it happened, or maybe they just haven't really had the safe space to spend some time kind of processing it and thinking about it, that if you help them create that safe space, that almost any amount of processing at all will just be really beneficial to them.
That's a great way to think about it. I want to go back to the strengths, and you mentioned the importance of social support. How might a victim advocate help a victim think about their social supports or building their social supports?
Yeah, that domain has really been a surprising and frustrating struggle for me, because we've had a really hard time figuring out like what elements of the social support are helpful And one of the problems that we had with social support originally is that we were using a lot of, traditional measures that just kind of based on like whether you had more or less of it and not really like what types of it. And we were finding that that could really be a double-edged sword. So for example, in our first study, the boys, the adolescent boys who were reporting the highest levels of social support were also reporting the highest levels of delinquency. And so I think sometimes, when we talk about these global constructs that we don't, like, what are you getting supported for? Are you getting supported for, like, go shoplift or, whatever? And but in a clinical setting, what we've done now is that we are really looking at more concrete supportive behaviors, and a lot of the things that a lot of DV agencies do are the things that are now performing well in terms of like our research in more general terms. So things like court accompaniment would probably be like a perfect example of, that you're just there with them so that they don't have to go through things alone. Sometimes giving we've looked at tangible and intangible resources. Certainly in terms of not just agencies, but friends and families. If you, like we know from a lot of the epidemiological research that the CDC does, that actually only a very, very small percentage of women ever go to shelter. I think in the INVA study, it was like 6%. I think it's like been under 10% in all of their studies. And the number one most common place that people go when they leave in an abusive relationship is they move in with a friend or a family member for a few weeks until they can, get a security deposit together and get sorted and things like that. And so I think that in terms of social support, that Lisa Goodman has done some nice work on this up in the Boston area, that one of the things that we don't do often enough, I think, as advocates and therapists, is that we think about the support we're offering, but we don't do enough to sort of build up the networks that are going to be there after we're gone, because you're going to be working with this person for 30 days or 60 days or maybe a year, but you're not going to be there forever. And, and so helping to strengthen their connections with friends and family members, or helping them, meet neighbors so that they have somebody they can, call or turn to or ask for a ride, or I think that those are just really important things that people should be thinking about. And going back to the topic that Heidi brought up, I also think that that is one of the things that I will say again, that I think a lot of the culturally responsive service agencies are really particularly good at, that they offer programming sometimes, either aligned with or even as part of the domestic violence or sexual assault agencies or whatever they are, that isn't necessarily focused on the violence, and so that there's opportunities for them to spend time together and observe traditions or holidays or whatever, and spend time with members in their community in ways that will lead to longer standing relationships, and that they're really a lot more focused on building community and not just helping individuals. And I think that's something that that all of us could really learn from them.
Wow, that strikes me that as we build out this area of thinking about what it takes to help improve victim and survivor well-being, we may have to expand our definition of victim services.
Yeah, that actually ties into another one of the findings that we've had over and over, and also to the piece that I ended on with thinking about, offering walking groups or exercise programs or things like that. And a lot of times in traditional services, everything gets oriented towards the victimization and the trauma. And what I often tell people is that if you think about services that there's really, that all of mental health and human and social services can really basically be boiled down into one of three different things. There's only three kind of buckets of activities. And the first two buckets are very traditional and conventional in that they're keyed into working and addressing the violence and the trauma that happened. And in both of those cases, and so in the first bucket, what you can do is that you can try to increase people's coping and responding to the trauma. So that might mean encouraging them to disclose to family members. It might mean encouraging them to go seek an order of protection, to trying to get them to do something that they're not already doing that's like a direct response to whatever the violence or trauma was. And the other thing that you can do is, or in, cognitive behavioral therapy, I often will give an example, like trying to increase positive self-talk would be an example of something in that bucket, or from a more insight or psychodynamic approach, exploring, trying to get people to turn attention to like their early childhood dynamics and family dynamics and devote some resources to exploring those. Like those would all sort of be in that first bucket of like do something more, more types of coping. But then the second bucket is trying to get people to switch out one type of coping for another. So if their go-to response to dealing with stress is to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs, well, then you don't want them to do more of that if they come to you for help, right? What you're gonna try to do is get them to switch out the substance abuse for some other kind of thing. Or in cognitive behavioral therapy, like a classic example of the same process would be like cognitive restructuring. So if they tend to catastrophize or whatever, like to try to get them to do that. And those are both good and solid approaches to do. But I think a lot of times that we spend too much time focusing on things that are really kind of looking back and focusing on the violence and the trauma. And so one of the things I said at the very beginning is that it's really, really important to keep your eye on the prize. And the prize, if you're working with a domestic violence victim, is the prize is not that this woman is going to have completely and utterly processed and analyzed all of the domestic violence that she's experienced. The prize is that she's going to, go on to a life of safety and well-being. And in that regard, this third bucket, which I usually say is either the oldest or the newest bucket, depending on what you think about, is it just kind of does a total end run around all of that violence and trauma and coping stuff, and it just focuses on strengths and resources and directly increasing strengths and resources as a way of directly increasing well-being. And in fact, that's why something like exercise or walking in the woods or volunteering or engaging in anti-violence activism or things like that can actually really help people overcome their trauma. Or even yoga. Like if you're doing yoga, you're not doing yoga about trauma, you're just doing the yoga, but it still makes you feel better. And so I think one of the things that almost all domestic violence agencies don't do a very good job at is that they don't spend enough time focusing on like, well, what would just increase the well-being of our population without always having to like walk it back and tie it directly back to like more processing of the trauma. Because at some point, just endlessly processing on that trauma can actually even, be counterproductive and can, you don't want that to be what people start organizing their lives around. So, I think that we just need to be doing a lot more things like that, and that we need to find ways, especially in places like domestic violence agencies. I actually think they'd have a lot more flexibility, many of them, than some of the other service settings that we have, but it would also be true in like schools or places like that, to add these other pieces into your programming and just make it a generally, health-promoting atmosphere and not one that's only designed to endlessly talk about domestic violence.
Well, that was a great way to wrap up. And I think we've gone a couple minutes over our time already. Sherry, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today. And Heidi, thank you for your insightful questions for that interview section. And folks who are watching, it's been a pleasure having you participate.
Yes, thank you again to everybody. Thank you so much, Susan and Casey and Heidi and everyone.
And we look forward to reading more about your work to develop out this strengths approach, and Heidi to your work in helping us remember to think about how we can apply this to culturally specific groups.
Thank you all so much.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.